let's go ahead and begin. We've got a lot of folks on. I'm Chris Adams, and I'm the president and co-founder of Balancing Act. We make an online budget simulation, but we've been around for more than 20 years doing public policy facilitation, and we've noticed that the budget is a very difficult one to discuss, whether it's about sort of general fund issues or about something more specific like public safety, which has been under some increasing pressure lately. It's a hard topic to discuss, and so we've been working on some ways to help frame up those discussions. The reason why everyone is here today is to focus on a particular interest of our times. We've got a number of things going on across our country with the COVID threat and the need for local government to respond to that in a very effective way, with the recession and the downturn in revenue that's causing in a majority of jurisdictions. And then at the same time, an increasing interest and sense of urgency about understanding racial justice and the role of law enforcement in that. And there have been some increasing calls to change funding for the police department, which sort of kicks us into the area of budget and finance and management and so forth. And so we've been thinking throughout these crises that we've been looking at in 2020, we've been trying to think of how we can create tools to support these conversations that need to be had. And I think it was in May when Aaron Mertz from the city of Phoenix contacted me with some ideas about how they might be able to adapt the simulation tool that we create to structure a conversation about policing and public safety, and looking at a fact-based conversation about what's expected of the police department and how it's funded and so forth, and maybe even look at some possible trade-offs or some changes. And then simultaneously, we stay in contact with the folks over at GFOA, and they're doing some great research and providing a lot of resources. And Shane Kavanaugh, who will also be sharing a little bit today, is producing a framework that I think this might be the first time that it's sort of getting debuted. He's been working on it for a while now, and he'll share it with you. But I think this might be the kind of the first public airing of it, and I think he's really looking for some feedback from folks. And just a word about the constellation of people on this call. You know, we're in a unique and I think a very fortunate position to be in contact with budget and finance and managers and administrators across North America a lot. And this is an issue that just keeps on coming up. And so when Aaron told us what he was doing, and we learned a little bit more about what Shane was doing at GFOA, we thought we'd just put together an informal meeting. And so this really isn't intended to be a webinar, it's intended to be a discussion. But the thing is, when we shared it just kind of softly with our clients, is we just had conversations with them. Almost everyone we talked to wanted to participate, which is great. But it meant that this conversation became a little bit larger than we intended. But that's fine. We'll try to accommodate a lot of different perspectives, and we'll try to accomplish some mutual learning. So we want this to be a conversation. Please, ask questions. I think there's a feature on Zoom that allows you to raise your hand. I've got a little slide that might help with that in just a moment. But I originally, because I wanted this to be more of a discussion than a webinar, I thought that we'd ask everybody to introduce themselves. I think we might take up a big chunk of our time if we did that. So instead, what I'd like to do is to just quickly go over the agenda, and then I'm going to put up a slide with the names of all the people that asked to participate. And then just so we can get some different perspectives, I want Aaron and Shane to have a little bit of structured time to sort of share what they've been giving a lot of thought to. But then I thought I've asked about 5 or 6 of you if you would just sort of share what you're seeing, so that we can just kind of get the benefit of a lot of perspectives. I asked a few of you from around the country, different sized cities and counties and so forth, so that we could just sort of share those perspectives. And then before we go on, we can just make sure that if anybody else has any perspectives, that you can go ahead and add that. So let me put up a slide with the agenda here. Quickly, and then we'll just go forward. Okay, just a sec here. Okay, so as I said, just a few words of welcome, and then I've got a few jurisdictions that I want to just say a little bit about how they're seeing this issue of calls to defund the police or to change policing services, et cetera. And then Jeff Barton, actually Jeff Barton is not able to make it. I'll let Aaron say a little bit more about that. But Aaron Mertz from the City of Phoenix is going to talk about a tool that they're creating. Shane Kavanaugh, as I mentioned, will be talking about the GFOA framework that they're presenting. It's very thoughtful and I think has benefits beyond just public safety, but is especially useful right now. And then we'll just have some discussion and then we'll end. And as I noted, we are recording this because we've had a number of folks who couldn't make it because for a variety of reasons, hurricanes, fires, public safety crises in their own cities, et cetera. So I'm going to ask a few cities and counties if they would just say a little bit. So I was going to ask Tacoma if they would go first. So Katie and Reed, I think, are you guys on?
Yes, thank you, Chris.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, and if you just share a little bit about what's going on with racial justice and pressures on police, and kind of what you guys are thinking of up in Tacoma these days. How does this look from your perspective?
So I think that we actually ended up taking the lead through the budget process because of timing. So we started our budget outreach process, and so we launched our Balancing Act tool along with some surveys. And through those two venues, we ended up receiving quite a bit of community feedback around policing. At the same time, our council adopted a transformational resolution talking about their commitment to anti-racism efforts and reviewing transformational police policy changes. And so right now that's on a slightly second track. And so we just concluded our Balancing Act and budget outreach. And then now we're starting some of our more detailed transformational effort outreach with specific communities. And it's a little bit more robust community feedback. Interestingly enough, so we just got back our feedback from our community survey, and I'm sure Reed would have some kind of thoughts about sharing this. But one of the really interesting things is, of course, one of the themes that we had was about reducing funding to the police department, and a lot of community feedback that community safety is not driven by police, it's driven by social services. Community safety is driven by other things that we do as an organization outside of just police patrol. But given that Balancing Act is kind of an opt-in tool, we're receiving a lot of questions from our council about how do you include information that's an opt-in, representing a subset of our community is the view. And so we're trying to kind of balance that now in the conversation, or figure out how to talk about when you get feedback from this one community group, how do you, or from your community that might be hard to implement, how do you use that?
Thank you very much for that. Reed, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Katie did a good job of summarizing how our discussions, and we did present to the City Council on the feedback we received last Tuesday, and we did get some pushback on is the feedback that we received representative of the community as a whole, we're trying to wade through some of that right now and provide a little bit more detail on the information we received back. But I thought it was a useful tool. I guess one of the things that we're struggling with is the way we set up our Balancing Act view. We don't really see the users don't really see the impact of reducing funding in an area. They just see their deficit get larger. And so I think you could looking at the quantities that people defunded certain areas and increased funding in other areas maybe is not the most useful to us. It's more of the overall, the very broad brush of, okay, the community would like us to spend less on this particular service and more in another particular service. And so how do we right size that? How do we get more detailed information from the tool? I think is probably one of the things that we're going to be dealing with.
That's great. I think that some of what Shane might present might help with some of that framework about how you show the consequences of a change. So thank you all very much. Toy, how are you all seeing this in the city of Raleigh?
Hey, thanks, Chris. So we had sort of like a vortex of events all sort of happen at once. So for the last couple of years, Raleigh has been looking to do a public safety staffing study. And so finally this past year we did that, and we spent 6 months really working with council and the community to build some input around the public safety needs. And so in February, we did the presentation on the staffing study, and we had $12 million of new needs with multiple new police and fire staff. Then COVID hit, and that number came down to 6 million with 48 new staff, just due to financial constraints. So we had spent all this time building up momentum around potentially even doing a tax increase to fund some of this stuff. And then the protest happened, and we got a lot of community engagement around defunding the police. So to start from like a $12 million tax increase with all these new staff to like 48 new staff, and $5 million of new needs, to where we ended up, which was council was very gridlocked in terms of where they wanted to go on this. So we ended up not adding anything. So now we know, and we've got this community buy-in from some groups on adding things like mental health units and greenway patrols. And we also have another fraction of our community that's very much against that. So we do have a lot of tension right now in the city of Raleigh. And so it was sort of just an interesting process watching how that sort of evolved throughout the budget process. We're also going through our strategic plan rewrite right now. So that's happening this week with council. So a lot of these themes that came up are now being incorporated into our strategic plan. So we created an Office of Equity and Inclusion. All staff are going through anti-racism training. We put out a statement about Raleigh, about what Raleigh believes around this topic. And so they're all sort of coming together, and we're still sort of marinating. So I'm interested to see what you all are doing on this topic and how you're using Balancing Act. We primarily use it as an internal tool to train staff as they go through the budget process. So I'm interested to see how you're using it with the public.
That's great. Thank you very much, Toy. Laura Reese in City of Fort Lauderdale, how does this look from your part of the world? What types of issues are you seeing and experiencing?
Thanks, Chris. Again, Laura Reese. I'm the director of OMB here in City of Fort Lauderdale. And some of what's happening here has made national news, if anyone's following along. Similar to Toy and Katie, we've had some outcry from the public to defund our police. A lot of that was driven by some of the protest activities that happened. Right around Memorial Day, we had a pretty heated protest in our downtown, which resulted in one of the protesters was struck with a rubber bullet, which became a big, CNN story. And then another protester was shoved, and one of our officers is being formally charged by, local officials. So we were really forced to sort of look at how we do policing here. There was an outcry to defund police. The amount that they came up with was $10 million. There's been the ability for folks to kind of weigh in on that through, the Balancing Act software. In addition, we have had several public meetings, either commission conference meetings. We've had joint meetings with the Budget Advisory Board and Budget Advisory Board meetings. And, they show up at all of these meetings, the folks who are against adding to police or would like to defund police. The different groups have a little bit of a different take about what that means. To some of the groups, it means, adding social services using the same amount of funds. To some groups, it just means, slashing the budget, reducing taxes. So there's a little bit of a different take. So, we've appreciated the ability to use Balancing Act as part of that opportunity for engagement, in addition to a lot of our virtual public meetings that we've held. In the end, we've had, our police chief was removed, and so we have an interim police chief. So that's, sort of makes it a little bit more difficult to rethink the police budget when you don't have, the permanent appointed position. We have a special board that's going to be meeting to make some advisory recommendations surrounding those issues. But at this point, our fiscal year 2021 budget, which we have 2 public hearings, September 3rd and 14th, it includes a consistent level of funding for the police department. And our city manager has shared that what that means to him is that there's funding in place, and we might rethink how we use that funding during the fiscal year. So that's kind of where we landed so far.
Interesting. Thank you. Tiffany, in Charlotte, North Carolina, we're moving to a couple of bigger cities now. We'll go to Detroit after this. How are you seeing this issue from your perspective?
So hello, again, I'm Tiffany Blackwell from the city of Charlotte. We are virtually hosting the RNC, so that's been exciting with our police department, speaking of super fun things to do. So we've had obviously, like across the country, a lot of calls to defund the police. Our police budget is around $300 million. One of the things we've been trying to do is educate our residents on how their tax bill is broken out so they can get a better understanding of what that number represents. Where we are in Charlotte is social services are funded through Mecklenburg County. And then our hard services, roads, streets, and everything else are funded through the city. So it's been a little bit of an adjustment to explain what specifically is a county function and what is a city function. We've also been trying to have a better listening ear, recognizing there are certain spaces in Charlotte that have historically been underfunded and underrepresented in conversations around the budget. And so we've been really trying to have intentional conversations, hoping to drive more traffic to our Balancing Act site so that we can gather more data points so that we can make more data influenced decisions. And then two, trying to have, since we're in the area of COVID, more interaction with people that we typically don't see engaged with the political process. Younger people have been way involved in a lot of our protests and demonstrations. So how can we garner understanding, look at things from an equity lens? Our entire budget will be looked at from an equity lens. We have an Office of Equity and Inclusion that will be partnering with us. And so we're really just hoping to get as much information from all of you all so that we can strive to do better.
Thank you very much for that, Tiffany. And just one thing, we are looking at some ways of showing secondary impacts from budget. So not just the impact on financial impact on balance or trade-offs between various spending items, but also to show an impact on a secondary indicator such as equity. So we're looking for folks as well that are interested in kind of developing that tool. Now let's go to City of Detroit and Nevrusk. We haven't met, but it would be great if you could say a little bit as well. And I think you might be the only person I know of who actually works within a police department. So maybe put a little bit of context on that.
Yes, Chris, thanks for inviting me. And my name is Nevrusk Nazarko. I am the agency CFO for the Detroit Police Department. And this is kind of like a new organization that was put in place after the Detroit came out of bankruptcy. And now the financial services, my office is part of the overall OCFOs and Department of Financial Services, but I have a team embedded in the police department, in the headquarters, that I supervise the fiscal services and payroll as well. As I said, this is a new structure that I've been here 2 years and in my point of view has worked very well. While I'll let the policy side of it, I believe Sam Geller from the mayor's office is here too. I can say a few things about the finances, and we have a very strong police chief that has taken the leadership and is taking the police department to places that I don't think we have been before. But like I said, I've been here 2 years. As everyone in this call probably knows or have heard, Detroit went through large challenges, financial challenges and otherwise, and even police department had some of their own challenges, non-financially related. But we have made big strides under the strong leadership of the mayor and the police chief, as I said, and the whole organization. And when it has come to finances, for example, Detroit Police Department or the City of Detroit has invested heavily into the police infrastructure. And what do I mean by that is that from the crime centers to the partnership with businesses through the green light called project that various businesses agree to participate in this, that install cameras into their places that live feed into our crime center, which is state of the art, I've been told, and we've had many departments from all over the country coming and taking a look at our new and state-of-the-art, as I said, crime center. There are many other investments, and the City of Detroit has made priority to invest in the police officers as well. I can talk about starting salaries that have come up that are kind of close to surrounding communities, because in the past there were problems that because of the low pay and benefits, City of Detroit was not competitive in hiring the best out there, and there have been changes in the finance side, increasing the starting pay and benefits, and then having many. I've been working, as a matter of background, as a finance director in 3 others. This is my 4th municipality that I've been working. But the issue here, and this is again a large department that it's not easy to attract and retain talent. But as I said, based on a strong leadership coming from the mayor's office, cooperation with the city council, the chief of police being proactive, big strides have been made, and the retention rate now is higher, and the turnover kind of like has gone down. But speaking of finances, for example, one initiative that when COVID hit, the mayor signed an executive order to give police officers hazard pay for a period of time, and we just paid last month, I'll give you the number, $4.7 million, in addition to their normal compensation, just because of the fact that they had to go out there and then face the danger and face the public and face the virus, as a matter of fact. So things like this, by and large, the budget of the Detroit Police Department is stable. From my perspective, I have not heard strong calls to that you here to defund the police. I believe our mayor has taken a stance in that is not going to defund the police. And as a matter of fact, now that we are flush with money because COVID now changed, a lot of our planning. But I tell you this, that the police department is well. I shouldn't say again. Should be careful. Not well funded, but is having enough resources to do their job and to do their job the way that our citizens expect.
Good. Thank you, Nevros, very much. And then for the last perspective, going to a little bit different sized town, a different part of the world, Zach Wolf from city of Marion, Iowa.
Yes, afternoon, everyone. Just give a little context because we're probably one of the smallest cities on the call today. Marion, Iowa is nestled right next to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Marion is not a diverse, racially diverse city at all. So with the protests following the death of George Floyd, it really took the city somewhat by surprise in that these discussions hadn't been handled previously. So it's opened up a space for the police department to start looking at these questions a new way. Politically, though, we have a new police chief who's also trying to work relationships with his staff at the time of dealing with COVID, some of the national protests, local protests, and then most recently too, we had a national declaration state of emergency here because we had a derecho storm that devastated our state and specifically this region. So we've had a number of different emergencies that we've been trying to address recently. I look going forward, the timing of this also coincided with when we were going to finalize our strategic plan. So being a smaller city, and racial equity not being a focus point of our strategic planning efforts, it did result in 2 additional strategies that we're looking at to look at inclusiveness as well as addressing barriers to feeling safe in the city. But we're excited to hear how other cities are addressing, are looking through the lens of equity and injustice through Balancing Act. Similar to the city of Raleigh, we're generally using Balancing Act as an internal tool and an education tool to let the public know where our budgets sit. But also one of the limitations of being a smaller city is we also don't have our chart of accounts set up to look at services or program areas. So that's one of the challenges we're trying to work through. So we're excited to hear whatever Ness is here today. Thank you.
That's great. Well, I think both Aaron and Shane will have some helpful insight on that. Well, let's go ahead and turn it over to Aaron. And Aaron, I think you should have the ability to share your screen. So this is Aaron Mertz from the city of Phoenix.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone.
Are you able to share?
What's that?
Are you able to share your screen?
Yes. Let me go ahead.
Oh, good.
Let me go ahead and do that for you guys here.
Great.
Let's see. All right, hopefully everybody can see this here. Can you all see the Balancing Act?
Yes.
Great, excellent. All right, so I'll leave this as the backdrop and then give you guys a little bit of background, as it were, on the city of Phoenix and where we're at. we had a spike in police shootings, shootings of residents about a year and a half ago. And so in some ways, this process has been going on for a while in Phoenix. I think it was July of 2019, so a little over a year ago, the mayor convened an ad hoc committee to police relations with the community and come up with some solutions. So that's actually one of the tabs I have open here. They just came back with it about a month ago, and there's a series of recommendations from this ad hoc committee that have come out of it. So that's something that the council is about to be taking up in the next month or so, probably. And then obviously, like everyone else, with the impact of the protests and the community response to that has also obviously has the council and the community looking for solutions and changes. And some of those are kind of the defund police side of the equation. Some of it is looking just to increase funding on the police side for additional services. So it's a challenge to figure out kind of what is really needed here. And so hopefully that's something that we can use Balancing Act as an opportunity to get more information out there for. So I'll go back to this tab here and kind of talk a little bit about, I should say or start, this is still a draft document, and we're still finalizing this, especially from a kind of an aesthetic standpoint. So don't get hung up too much on kind of the way it looks, but the idea that Jeff Barton, our budget director and deputy city manager, had was to say, look, let's get ahead of this a little bit and have a tool prepared that can help the council and the community really understand what does the police department do. And we're fortunate that we have what we call an inventory of programs. It's kind of a zero-based budget type of approach to the budget that we've been doing for, gosh, probably 7-8 years now. And so that's kind of what forms the basis of this Balancing Act tool. I'm going to jump over here real quick and show you, this is our most recent inventory. And it's a bit small, I apologize, but the idea behind it basically is to break every department into its component pieces, right? And into the programs that it provides. And for a small department, that may just be 1 or 2 programs. For something like police, scroll down here, you can see they have, I think, 65 programs or something like that they are broken into. And so the idea is that you can jump down into a given department and go piece by piece and see, for example, for the police department, okay, the airport bureau, what does it do? Here's all the different funding sources, FTEs, et cetera, et cetera. And again, because police has such a large amount of programs, you can really kind of get down into the nitty gritty. I think the reality, you won't be surprised, is that not necessarily tons of folks are going to go down to that level, but I think it's been a helpful tool to have, I don't want to say in our back pocket, but sort of that foundation to have been set to say, hey, look, if you want to go this far, you can go there. And it's what we're hoping is it's going to dovetail really nicely into this kind of what we're calling a comprehensive budget review for the police department. So the idea is to load the tool with all of those 65 some odd programs and say, okay, great. Community members, council members, if you're interested in defunding, if you're interested in reallocating funding, here's a way to sort of conceptualize that. So you guys are familiar, obviously, with how the tool works. You click down on it, you can increase and decrease. Our idea here, and this is the part, again, where some of the aesthetics will, I think, get a little prettier as we go on, but we've had our police department go through each of those programs and say, okay, we want you to be able to say to folks, if you reduce funding, what's the impact, right? And I think unsurprisingly, sometimes it's hard to get a quantitative impact to defunding. So the example I brought up here with our downtown ops unit, I think some of the impacts here are not as concrete maybe as we would like. In some of the other program cards, it is more concrete. If you reduce funding by X percent, 20%, response times increase by 30 seconds or a minute or what have you. So the idea behind it is, whether we're able to get something really concrete or not, the idea is to get people to start to think about, if we make changes to this, what's the impact, right? And it's one thing to just generically say, I'd like to defund police. It's another thing to say, well, what specifically do you want to defund? If you had to choose between program A and program B, what would you do? And so, like Chris said, I think that's our goal, is to hopefully give some structure and some form to the discussion, and to hopefully make it a little more productive in that sense. So again, the council is going to take this up probably in the next month or two, and we'll see where it goes. But we actually just rolled out the Balancing Act for the city overall in February, and had a really positive response. We typically have in-person budget hearings, roughly 20 or so during the budget cycle. And so Balancing Act, obviously a great way of and kind of widening the umbrella and bringing more folks in who aren't able to show up in person, don't want to show up in person. So it was a really positive thing. Hopefully some of that positive momentum will carry over into using it for police specifically. So we'll see how it goes, but that's kind of where the city of Phoenix is at.
No, that's really helpful. And there are all sorts of conceptual issues. And Reed from Tacoma was mentioning they went live with their budget engagement. And one of the issues that they had was illustrating the consequences. And it sounds like you're dealing with that as well. And I think Shane might have some ideas to help with that. But that is one of the more difficult things to do, is to quantify what it would look like to cut or to transfer in some ways. So hopefully we can learn from each other and collect some best practices and some ideas on that. All right, Shane, let's turn it over to you to tell us what you've been working on at GFOA.
All right. Go ahead and share my screen here.
So Sharon, Aaron, you may need to unshare your screen.
Yeah, let me see if I can
or stop sharing it, I guess.
Figure out how to get that going here.
There you guys see my slides now, Chris?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Awesome. All right, thank you, everybody. I'm going to take about 10 minutes here to share with you a little bit about financial foundations for thriving communities, as Chris mentioned. We've started applying this lens to police budgeting. The project itself is something we've been working on for the past probably 3 to 4 years. So a little bit about what this is the first thing we'll be touching, and then we'll be talking about how to apply it to public safety funding. So what is Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities? In essence, it's a Nobel Prize winning framework about how to allocate or to, I guess, have sustainable use of resources in a shared environment like a city budget. We took that Nobel Prize winning body of work, translated it to public finance specifically, and proved out the translation using about 25 different case studies. So to give you a gist of what this framework is, I'm going to use a little economic parable called The Tragedy of the Commons. You may have heard of this. So the parable goes like this. You've got a grazing area that's owned by all the farmers who surround it, so they all own it collectively. Because they all own it collectively, they have the same incentive, and that incentive is send your animals onto the grazing area as much as possible, because if you don't, the next guy will. And so everyone has that same incentive, sends their animals onto the grazing area as much as possible, and you end up with this, which is the tragedy of the commons, right? So our premise is that the public budget is very much the same. You have each department, all different stakeholders trying to get their piece of the pie. Everyone does that. You end up with the tragedy of the low pyramid budget, right? So a big problem in a resource-constrained environment like we face now. And the question might be, okay, what does this have to do with police? So the solution to this problem has been boiled down by GFOA into these 5 pillars, and I'll point out especially pillar 5 and pillar 2. Treat everyone fairly, build trust and open communication. We at GFOA are saying these need to be explicit goals of your financial decision-making process. So that is, I think, certainly the first time GFOA has released anything, we're building trust with the public and treating everyone fairly. We're explicit goals of the process, and perhaps the first of any framework that I'm aware of for public finance decision-making. And before I start to get into how to apply this to public safety or our work in that area, show you one more slide of why we think this is an important framework. So what we've got on this next slide here is something called the 3 levels of system change. And this is from an organization called FSG. And their kind of point is, if you want to change any system, you have to think about it in 3 levels. So you've got the top policies, practices, resource flows. So I think we can all very familiar with that in the budgeting world, right? Pretty straightforward. Below that, you've got relationships and connections, power dynamics. And at the bottom, you've got mental models. So to tie that to our problem, I'm going to give you some examples as we go through. The mental model that we're saying should be applied to budgeting is this tragedy of the commons model, where this is a shared resource that we have to figure out how to use together cooperatively. Whereas I think the old mental model was more of a win-lose game, where if, you know, I win, you lose, and the kind of tragedy of the commons there. And we'll see a couple of other mental models that are applied to public safety in particulars when we go through this. And the Financial Foundation model addresses all three of these. So we talked about the tragedy of the commons here. Those 5 pillars relate to our middle layer. And then, of course, GFOA is all about the policies, practice, resource flows that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So this is kind of tying it all together. So let's see a bit about how we're applying all of this to public safety. So we've got a research project going with ourselves and What Works Cities are the main collaborators to work through the application of this model to public safety. We're also bringing in a bunch of other folks. So what I'm sharing with you is kind of our preliminary work right now. So you'll see some of our kind of early ideas. So the first point here is the long-term vision, and that public safety isn't just a budget issue. And there are 3 perspectives you might need to really think about. So the first being, what is people's day-to-day lived experience with police? And so when people say defund the police, do they really mean they want to talk about budget numbers? Or do they really mean they have a concern with their day-to-day experience with policing services? And might you need to address that as a prerequisite to kind of productive conversation about public safety? And the second point there is, what are the long-term goals? Because this may be goals that are bigger than can be addressed in one budget cycle. And I'd like to give you 2 examples of my first 2 bullets. And then, of course, our third bullet, what should the budget be? And we'll get to a bit more on that. But here's an example of day-to-day lived experiences. So this is an example of a front-end voice policy. So use of force could be something that people are very concerned about in this time. And so the question is, are you addressing that concern? Because it's not really a budget issue. I think we saw Phoenix is doing some of that in their work with their committee that they had. But this is an example from Camden County, where they had this old policy that had none of these features. And then they went through a process that featured heavy community engagement to come up with a new use of force policy that had all of these very good features. And you can imagine having something like this in place would make it easier for then people to talk about funding, because some of these day-to-day lived experiences have been addressed. Next point here is long-term vision. And so I'd like to use an example of the Cure Violence Project. You may have heard of this. It's a model for dealing with community-level violence based in epidemiology. So that is a different mental model than perhaps kind of the traditional policing model. And because it's a different mental model, the Cure Violence folks, I've been having talks with them, advocate strongly that it's best located in a public health department, not a police department. And, you know, it could be there, kind of what they find is that public health departments many times are just not really able to, don't have the capacity to really run a program like this in year 1. So it ends up in the mayor's office as a special project, but curing violence is not a special project that can be done in the course of maybe 1 term of office. So could it be started in the mayor's office and then ultimately transitioned to a public health department after that capacity is built? And we've got here on this little graphic I'd like to show you is the consequences of not having a long-term vision in this area. So this is my hometown, Chicago. This is the kind of, you see the rise in killings began with fire, also known as Cure Violence, was cut, their funding was cut. And I actually ran into the founder of Cure Violence, one of the civic groups here in Chicago, and he was explaining to me a number of years ago, explaining to me the problems they're having getting funded. And it was like budgeting 101, where he's like, yeah, you know, we don't fit in any one department. You know, we're more a preventative program, not a remediative program. So we just don't fit into the budget process, the types of decisions that are made. And it was exactly like, you know, like I said, a public budgeting textbook. So because there's no long-term vision for using this program in the city of Chicago, it didn't survive the budget process, and you can see the results right there. So let's move on to building trust and open communication. Something we've been talking about with What Works Cities is sharing meaningful data with citizens. So just an example here, because you've got like number of police officers examples, a very common objective that is put in a typical budget document. But you could imagine, right, if your measure success is number of police officers, that doesn't really lend itself to an intelligent conversation about how to use police resources. So what other data might you use? And this is an example from Stanford's finding or data where they say this particular data set shows that police require less suspicion to search Black and Hispanic drivers than white drivers. So having this sort of data transparent can sort of open up the conversations about what to do with some of these police resources. Third pillar I'll get into here is collective decision making. So just a few, so Balancing Act is all about collective decision making. So what Chris asked me to do is share some like big picture national overview stuff. So I pulled together a few survey items. A few points here. This is from a June 11th YouGov survey shows that there's only a very small number of people along the top that don't think police need to be reformed, and then you've got the middle right there who think there does need to be a big reform. But only a fraction really that are in favor of defunding the police. This is kind of another item from that same survey across cities, suburbs, towns, rurals. People think we need more cops on the street, not less, which is interesting. And then not too many actually favor cutting the police department. And that's June 11th, so we can see that actually change over time in this more recent survey. So now you've got this survey where you see the people who think no changes are needed has gone down a bit, and then you've got minor and majors a bit different. But the folks in favor of abolishing the police department, like the most radical step, still doesn't have a ton of support. And then kind of a last point here is I'll show this graph kind of shows there's a lot of division amongst people about whether they think should be increased or decreased. Really kind of the takeaway from all this is I think there's not a clear, opinion out there amongst the public of what ought to be done. There's a lot of kind of, I think, for dialogue on this point. And then the kind of last thing I wanted to bring up here is Americans' confidence. We see recently the trust in police has taken a little dip. But if you look at this next slide, police are still the fourth most trusted institution in the country. So they do better than organized religion, public schools, Supreme Court. Congress is down at the bottom of this list. They fell off the page. So the kind of point being, even though trust has gone down the police, they're still relatively trusted by a lot of people. And then, Chris, I'm out of time, so I don't want to go further. I can stop here, or if you want, I can just cover this.
Shane, go ahead and take a couple more minutes and finish up. I think that's fine. This is a good start.
All right. Cool. All right. So these are the rules. This is kind of what we've all been waiting for, the budget rules. So kind of the takeaway here is that the typical government budget process is incremental, where last year's budget becomes next year's budget. And I think we all know where that's gotten us, right? We've gotten these police department programs that have been kind of the old layered on top of, or the new layer on top of the old, funded past the point of affordability or relevance. So having a rule where historical precedent is not the primary determinant of spending, instead cost effectiveness is the new rule. And I think we heard Phoenix talk about they've got like a zero-based type of program. That would be an example of that. Another rule that I like Phoenix brought up here is department divisions are not the best unit for budgeting. Instead, more granularity is needed. And so this is, I think, an interesting point is program budgeting was brought up. So we did a little study, actually, a couple weeks across program budgets from a fairly large number of cities of different sizes across the states. And you've got about like 30 to 40 different programs make up your typical police department budget. I think Phoenix mentioned they had 60 as a bigger department. But we often see patrol as those programs, and it makes up 40% of the police department's budget, right? That is still a huge chunk that is not very granular, especially when you look into the statistics where you've got somewhere between 11 and 2% of a police officer's time is spent dealing with actual crime. And then you've got the top 5 problems are disabled vehicles, traffic accidents, domestic arguments, alarms, not fires. So the point being, within that patrol, there's a lot of things happening, and to make decisions about where resources need to be best allocated, we probably need more granularity than just kind of stopping at patrol can give us. So how do we, as a profession, go a bit deeper? We might need to go a bit deeper than just program budgeting in some way. All right, and kind of the next rule here I'd like to share with you is think outside the box, look for multidisciplinary solutions. So I think we've heard a bit about this on the call, but this is, I think, a very salient budget comment by a North Carolina chief. If we lost one crisis intervention counselor, I'd have to hire 2 more police officers for less of an effect. So I don't think there could be a better budget quote from a police chief than that about the value of having a multidisciplinary solution for some of these problems. And then privileging prevention over remediation. So homeless being a great example. So criminalization of homelessness, where you basically had a revolving door to the justice system for homeless individuals, not very effective and definitely not very cost effective. So a lot of places found a lot of success through preventative approaches that can be far less expensive, something much better for. And then lastly is use evidence of what works. So taking kind of a bias towards approaches that evidence backing them up, or at least using experiments to try new ideas, and it can be things like innovation funds and other sorts of approaches that give the opportunity to take kind of try small ideas before investing a lot of money in things that may or may not work. So using a budget process that respects experiments and gives the opportunity for experiments to be quite powerful. So just to kind of one more slide or a couple more points here. If you're looking for resources on the kind of types of budgeting that are out there, we have these resources from GFOA. So those are all some available to you right now if you learn more about zero-based, priority-based, or program budgeting. We also have a project right now called Rethinking Budgeting for 2020 and beyond, where we're going to be kind of taking a whole new approach to this. So that will be something you can look forward to. And I'm just going to, show you one last resource here for you. This is something that's available right now on this topic. We just released a paper on financial policy, fines, and fees, asset forfeitures. So for a resource that is fully baked, as opposed to just the kind of early out stuff I'm showing you today that's out and about, and gotten really good feedback from folks. If that's a topic in your community you would like to learn more about, that is available to you. So Chris, I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So we got about, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes left. So I wanted to prioritize that time for discussion. So we've got a lot of people. So I'm gonna, if you want, we can try all talking. Maybe that won't be a problem. But if you want to raise your hand, Zoom keeps on changing its interface. So I think you raise your hand by going to the participant screen. I know Larry Schooler already has his hand raised, or you can put something in chat and I can read it. But it'd be better if you read it yourself. And just while you're thinking of your questions, I did want to just share one slide that we find useful. This is sort of our distilled wisdom from doing public engagement over the last 23 years or so, and applying it to the budget context. And what we think is that there's sort of 4 major things you need to do. So what Reed and Catherine are talking about, those of you who have done budget engagement, this is what we think makes it high quality engagement. And we call it the 4 C's: constraints, context, consequence, and content. And so, you want to convey certain things like you can't spend more money than you have, you've got certain restricted funds, that's critical. Providing context, so showing why an item is important. So why is it important to have an Office of Racial Justice? We had a county in the Midwest that found that they needed to do a little further explanation so the public would understand why the county's even doing that. History and performance indicators, some of the things that Shane was talking about, I think would be really useful. Consequence, that's one of the themes of what Aaron was talking about, and what in Tacoma they were talking about, is how do you show what the effects are? And that can be a really difficult thing to do, but it's really important so that people don't see cuts as being free money or ads as just coming out of nowhere. So to show what those effects are, and then even now that second point, how prepared are we for the future? So those entities that invested heavily in a rainy day fund or a reserve fund, they're probably a little bit happier than those who didn't, given the recession that's going on. And then also looking at vulnerable population. And then this last one, content. This is a really important one. We've seen some efforts at public engagement completely miss the mark because it didn't focus on the questions and issues and areas that the public cared about. And so Shane talked a little bit about that, but trying to figure out, what is the public-facing outcome or performance or service level that the public really cares about and can see, that has a budget implication that you want to engage them on. And so we're really encouraging you to think about, what are the key issues, and to not provide a lot of minutia. We've had a few of our clients that have, asked, how much we spend on copying. Well, that's not really an issue for the public to think about. That's a management issue. But to think about what are the key issues for the public to think about, and also just so that people don't become single issue people, not whether it's public safety or parks or whatever, is to put people in the shoes of you all as leaders and public administrators, to think about what's the entirety of what's government providing. So it's not just about what I want from government, but it's what it's the entirety of what government does. So we think that we hope that this is useful. Aaron and Shane, very great conversation. If you have questions, let me see. I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat. let's see, one from Katie Johnson. I'll just go ahead and ask it. Or Katie, do you want to ask it? Are you on still?
Sure, I can. I just was curious. So one of the things that Shane brought up that I think has been really true for us is that issue around patrol. So when we talk about kind of who initiates some of this work, we try to really work in collaboration with our police department. But we have really struggled to get them to think or describe patrol with any other level of granularity than 40% of operations are patrol related. So I was just curious if anyone has had success with that or has examples from your police departments.
And I could throw out for the group, I'd be happy to send the studies that did the activities studies of the police departments and what they have, the ones that they did look at what they are spending their time on, which would, I think, probably.
All right, that'd be great. Larry Schooler, who used to be with the City of Austin and is now helping with communications, including on police and budgeting issues. So Larry, what's your question?
Well, Chris, I guess I just wanted to throw out something in response to what I heard, I think, Tacoma talk about when it comes to the opt-in sort of segmentation of the population. And, you know, just recommend that cities like Tacoma and others look at ways to reach audiences who don't have internet access and who may not even know about opportunities to engage. One of the things Chris and I are working on is a telecast for the city of Denver, where it'll include a dial out to a pretty large sample, random sample of the Denver population focused on zip codes and districts with lower internet access. And so, you know, I think it's critical in this day and age that we not expect everybody with an interest in something like the budget or something like police funding to come to us. So it's about sort of being where people are, both virtually and in real space. And I think part of that is, you know, not bypassing the internet entirely, but pairing the internet with some offline resources like phone calls or texts or the like. So just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you, Larry.
Want to also share, so we didn't talk about this, but we made paper copies of a similar balancing act tool. It was kind of like a replacement, and we went to food banks and homeless service providers and many other kind of direct service provision in the community to try to get paper at least out. And we had limited response, but it's kind of trying to be a little bit more creative. But Larry, you bring up a good point. We also have a TV station, and we didn't think about airing kind of something on it, which probably would have been really nice.
I'm happy to follow up with you, Katie, if you're interested.
Yeah, City of Denver is, they're anticipating a tough budget season. This is, as Denver is my hometown, anticipating a tough budget season, both because of the downturn, but also because of some pretty tough questions about policing and policing services and policing funding. And so Larry and I are working with them in a very proactive way to you know, try to design an engagement effort that will engage the whole city, reaching out to people as well as letting people come to them, but also to respect, as I said, those 4 C's, the constraints, the context, the consequence, and the content, and to really make it as robust as possible so that the city can explain these very difficult times and to get some good informed input. Let's see, there are other hands that are raised. Sorry, this is a much bigger meeting than I thought. Oh, Andrew Klein. Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to comment on some of the information that Shane shared. He showed several graphs on public opinion related to whether police departments should be get more funding, less funding. I think what cities and counties really are going to want to do is to present some trade-offs to their residents. It's not so much just should we increase or decrease funding for police, but what's more important? Would you be interested in reducing funding for the police if you could then take that money and invest it in whether it's mental health services, youth development, neighborhood revitalization? Because obviously, as you said, Chris, constraint is one of the C's. I mean, we're all constrained, and some more than ever. And so I think that's really the question that we need to be asking, not just up or down on the police.
Yeah. You know, that's a really good point. And Katie and Reed, I hope that you're okay with this, but One of the things that you guys were among the very first to go forward with a very robust public engagement effort on the budget since the George Floyd incident happened. And one of the things that happened, as we're seeing sort of across the board, is that people have cut funding to police, and you're not alone in that. But it was interesting when you did your sort of live and interactive version of it. People cut the police, but they didn't have these other trade-offs. They didn't have these other alternatives to put it into. And I think it's because, you didn't really anticipate that would happen, because that would, in normal times, it would have happened that way. But that's one of the things we're finding as well, is that, okay, what are these trade-offs? If we were to cut something from the police, should we invest it in a more robust 911 system that can do, more sophisticated dispatching? Or should we invest it in teen mental health providers? Or should we invest in just something completely different? And so I think that's one of the things that we're learning, and you guys were kind of the first public ones to sort of find that out. We had an example of a city in Texas that actually did provide some of the same alternatives I just discussed, like mental health first responders, more robust 911, that type of thing. And a lot of folks moved funding from the police to those other services. So it wasn't that they didn't want to fund public safety, they wanted to do so in a different way. All right, are there other questions? Let me see, I know there's some in the chat here, but I don't see any hands. Let's see here.
I think Laura.
I'll just say that Toy just wrote in the chat that Andrew wrote a great book called City on the Line. So Andrew, at in a past life, he was the budget and research director at the City of Baltimore. I'll agree, it is a great book, Toy. I agree. City on the Line is a good read, and it really does talk about budgeting for outcomes in a very robust way. Let's see, we've got a couple more hands raised. I'm looking for where they are. Oh, Julian in San Jose.
Yeah, I was really curious on two questions. I definitely really like Andrew's point regarding those trade-offs, and I'd really love to hear from some cities. Maybe Katie can illuminate this, because you guys tried both a survey and using Balancing Act, which is something that we're contemplating in San Jose, and which of those two sort of yielded the best results for figuring out what it is the public wanted with regards to those trade-offs between defunding and other issue areas. The other issue I wanted to bring up that San Jose is sort of facing is that we have a uniquely low-staffed police department compared to other large cities. And so, compared to some places like New York or Los Angeles, you can sort of cut the police budget and move money around to fund sort of a different issue area if that's what the public is interested in. But because our police department is so thinly staffed, there's a lot less wiggle room to sort of move resources around. And I was wondering if any other cities sort of found themselves in the same position, and how they were thinking about tackling that problem, especially if the public is very much interested in reallocation of police resources.
Yeah, that's good. And while you're thinking about that, I'll note Katie put in the chat, and she's absolutely correct. People did reallocate money to housing, to affordable housing, and to homelessness services. So that's a great point. Anybody have any thoughts for Julian?
I think, Julian, if you want to connect on the survey benefits, we can connect offline. I think that one of the challenges we faced is that in the Balancing Act tool, I think you're getting two types of feedback. So one, we had a $67 million budget gap, or around 15%, that people had to fill in addition to reprioritizing resources. And so the results are a little mixed, right? And so even our council, I think one of the things we tried to explain is you have to cut everything, actually. Do you know what I mean? To fill that gap, let alone how did you protect or fund other areas? So there's kind of two levels of feedback. So the surveys did help us kind of tease out a little bit of information to help describe what our community wanted and the strategic priority areas a little bit when they talk about safety, what safety meant to our community more specifically, as well as then getting the feedback on how to address a budget gap and reprioritize resources. And so I do think having those two tools was a little bit more helpful to provide kind of a more nuanced view of that feedback. But kind of to Chris and kind of the point of the overall group, having both the reduction and reprioritization did cloud some of that, the feedback.
Yeah, and just one quick thing. I don't know if we've got a feature right now. We have about 40 university-based local government researchers that are working with Balancing Act, and we have a methodology now. If you want to get a scientifically valid sampling of people going through the simulation, we now have the capacity to do that. So if anybody is interested in that, we can actually give you some really good information. There's a lot of researchers that are saying it's actually much more reliable data than a survey, because a survey doesn't take into account cost effects, it doesn't take into account trade-offs, and it doesn't necessarily take into account both sides of the ledger, the spending side and the revenue side. So that's another new feature that we're rolling out, and if there's a local government that wants to pilot it with us, let us know. Laura Reese, and we should probably just maybe take another 5 minutes or so here and then let everybody go. I don't want to keep everybody from their other work, but Laura, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I had one comment, really good information. It really helps us to think through some of the issues. I don't know if you all kind of have a similar situation, but with our public safety folks, anytime you're going to cut, it's death and destruction. So the outcomes are never palatable at all. So that's a challenge to get through when folks are asking, you know, what happens if we cut your budget? You know, the earth stops, you know, it completely stops moving. So that becomes a struggle for us. So I guess my question to you all is, when we talk about budget cuts, especially in public safety, and you know, you really look towards, do you need to do layoffs or, you know, reductions of staffing? Have any of you found an opportunity to repurpose staff, where you take the staff that previously did one thing and use them for something different identified by the public? Or is it typically you reduce the current staff and you substitute a different group of folks?
And Laura, that's an interesting point, and that's one that I think we've been thinking a lot about here, because the reality is that, at least in Phoenix, you know, 80–90+% of Phoenix police budget is people, right? It's positions. And so when people say defund the police, you're talking about cutting positions, and that decision making becomes a lot thornier. It feels good when it's really abstract, and yeah, we probably have some waste we can cut. But the reality is, when it's all tied up in people, and in the case of the city, we don't have a ton of vacancies. There's going to be some very difficult decisions that council members have to make, and community members have to make on that regard. I think that one of the solutions that is being bandied about now is saying that maybe it tries to split the difference on that, is to say, what are the areas that we can civilianize, and probably attempt to avoid the sworn cuts, and find resources elsewhere so that sort of that addresses the concern about maybe over policing in certain areas, civilianize certain areas, without having to actually do cuts. So that for us as budgeters, we say, okay, yeah, but that seems like a bunch of net adds, right? Like, where is the money actually coming from? And for sure, that's a challenge to figure out. But I will say that I sense that in Phoenix, there's some maybe murmurs and movement in that direction. And so it's a way to kind of get at some of the depolicing without necessarily having to go down the road of, okay, we're gonna be cutting officers and doing layoffs.
Thanks, Aaron. I was thinking a little bit about that when the conversation started happening in our city. And I was even thinking of maybe a phased in approach, where if we're looking to transition from police officers to case management, as we get a vacancy, we just don't fill it or something like that. It just seems to be so much more palatable than having, you know, mass layoffs or, you know, real people impacted in real ways. So I'm thankful for your input on that. Thank you.
Yeah, just for what it's worth, yeah, that's like actually the exact sort of route that I think has been talked about, using vacancies as they come up and freezing those positions, then using the long-term savings to potentially fund some of the civilianizing and whatnot. So it's definitely one approach that might be, like you said, maybe a little more palatable than some of the other options.
Yeah. That's terrific. Aaron, I wish that Jeff Barton could have been on today, the Deputy City Manager of Phoenix, but what is, I think folks on this call might be interested in seeing the results of your initial engagement effort coming up. What's your time frame for that?
Yeah, I think that in theory, this is probably going to go to council sometime in September. Some of this is pretty fluid still, obviously. Council's been on a break to some extent through August here. Now they're just getting back. So yeah, September into October, theoretically, we'll kind of see how some of this shakes out. Again, we had this big ad hoc committee that just released their findings, and so that's kind of taking up a lot of the bandwidth right now. But yeah, I think the hope is to ultimately loop in the balancing act tool and use it to help guide some of the further discussions that come from that. So we'll kind of see about the timing, though.
That's great, and we'll look forward to seeing how that goes, and we'll share if there's some applicable results. We'll share it with this group. Right. Anything else? Shane, I thought I might give you the. Sorry, Doug Linkard. So Doug Linkard is. I'll just introduce him. He is my former state senator from a long time ago, but he's also a former Denver City Council member, and he is currently the president of the National Civic League.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to inject one other perspective, which is to look at public safety more broadly from just city budgets to the whole community's work, and think of public safety broadly to include the work of nonprofits and school districts, and look at more of a comprehensive package of all of the expenses that are going into public safety and all of the efforts of various people in the community that are contributing toward public safety. So I think cities sometimes run the risk of thinking too narrowly and thinking of just what the city's impact is and not the broader community.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I agree with that. Shane, any last comments before we adjourn? We can't hear you, unfortunately.
Sorry about that, Chris, my bad. I was saying that thank you for having me. Appreciate everyone offering all the comments and lessons they've learned. And yeah, maybe to just add something Doug mentioned, I see this Toy here was also bringing up, is the challenge that cities don't have a lot of expertise in services. But I think it's a fantastic point, and it probably gets, and this is something part of Financial Foundations we didn't get into, but it's about creating like networks essentially, right? Because the traditional government structures of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is good for certain things, right? It can get the job done in certain cases, but in other cases you need network relationships for creating kind of, I guess, stratas between like the nonprofit, as Doug mentioned, sectors, other organizations. And so we've got a couple of fantastic examples of places that have done this very well. State of San Antonio, San Antonio's 2020 vision is a great example. So I'd really encourage you to check that one out. County of San Bernardino has done some really cool stuff. And so we can share that information with folks if that's something people are interested in learning more about.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your contributions. It was a large meeting, but I think we did a pretty good job of getting a lot of different perspectives. And thanks in particular to Aaron and Shane. So we'll be in touch. If you have ideas, please feel free to shoot me an email. And if it looks like it would be productive, we'd be glad to pull together this or a similar group together again in the future. So thanks everyone, and take care, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.